As Mark has mentioned, I'm actually based in Singapore now. I moved to Singapore last August, but I was living in Shanghai for about 14 years. When I first got to Shanghai in 2004, to pay my rent, I would go to my bank, which was ICBC. I would take out my money from the teller because I couldn't take out that much money from the ATM. I would put it in a paper bag. I would walk it across the street, and I would deposit it at Bank of China. That was, in my argument, the first use of mobile payments in China or Asia, predating AliPay by a long time. If I look forward to when I left last year in 2018, 14 years later, I would pay my staff using AliPay. I invested in a financial product from Baidu, and I exchanged expenses with friends using WeChat Pay. The entire nature of digital payments changed over the course of that 15 years, and I would argue will continue to change. So today, I'm going to look at a couple of different trends that we are seeing in the market across Asia. Just very briefly on Kapronasia, we are a market research and consulting company with offices in Singapore and Shanghai. And so these are the things that have caught our eye that we thought would be relevant for the audience here. First of all is this massive shift to digital. So the smartphone is now the tool of choice for billions of consumers across China, not just in, or across Asia, not just in China and India, but increasingly here in Southeast Asia as well. The move to real-time and faster payments. National payment infrastructures are going through a tremendous phase of modernization over the past decade, especially here in Asia, and that's having implications in terms of the products and services that banks are able to offer. Payments as infrastructure, but platforms and data to drive revenue. The model of using payment fees to drive revenue is changing rapidly. The players that are successful in the digital space are offering platform opportunities that are reliant more on the value-add products and services that we can put on top of payments, not on the payments themselves. And the coming challenge to cards. When we look at consumer cross-border payments, and I'm experiencing this now, my credit card from Singapore, I pay a 3% fee just to use it in Thailand, plus the merchant and the fee that they pay. So we're seeing changes there as well. Looking at digital, often when I display this slide, people say there's something wrong with the formatting on the slide. There's no line on the US on the right, but that is actually to scale. When you look at what's happening in China around digital payments in 2017, the amount of payments that went across the network in China as compared to the US was incredibly magnitudes different. And that kind of illustrates the shift that we're seeing across Asia. The fact that people are using their devices to make payments. We're seeing that in the number of non-cash transactions across the region that are now representing a larger percentage of the overall cash transactions globally and then within the region. These are some global numbers that we have looking at non-cash transactions by region. And you can see, although the legend seems to have gone up, the emerging Asia and mature Asia Pacific account for a significant amount of this increase over the past 10 years, and only expected to increase as we go forward into 2020, 2021. When we look specifically at Asia, certainly around emerging Asia, we're seeing a lot of uptake, and this is not surprising. In places like Singapore or Hong Kong, the uptake of non-cash is not as rapid because in many of these places, cards have been the primary choice of non-cash transactions for many years. But in places like China, China to a certain extent has skipped credit cards and moved directly to digital payments on the back end. So there's this emerging Asia and the countries involved in that, including Thailand here, seeing tremendous uptake in digital payments. And this is all being driven by outsized growth in smartphone penetration and smartphone usage. When you look at smartphone penetration globally, according to the GSMA, it will top out at about 66% in 2020. In China, that number is meant to be 73%. And then across the region, when we look at many of the countries across the region, smartphones have become the device of choice. And it's unsurprising when you think about it. In China, you can buy a Xiaomi phone, which is one of the largest producers of smartphones, for around $100. And it's fully capable of presenting a QR code, which is an increasingly important part of transactions as well. In fact, QR codes have become the rage in China, most certainly, and then across Southeast Asia as well. In China, we did our first study on mobile payments in about 2010, 2011. And we had a big spreadsheet, and on the spreadsheet we had, Bank of China was working with China Mobile on an NFC-driven pilot in Chengdu. And the Bank of Shanghai was working with China UnionPay on an NFC-driven pilot in Shanghai. The challenge with NFC, though, is you need to have the hardware to support it, and it puts you beholden to the other players in that network. So for AliPay, who was the first company to kind of provide QR code payments in this space, they had the choice of working with a China Mobile or a China UnionPay, which lowers their market power significantly. They came up with the idea of using QR code payments. QR code payments are hardware independent. They don't require a big footprint on the phone to be able to either read or display a QR code. And they've been integral for facilitating that shift in places like China to digital payments in the offline scenario. There's two forms. If you're not, I think most of you here in Thailand are familiar with prompt pay, but in most cases, there's kind of two forms of these ways that these are presented. I'll talk about the one on the right first. This is a displayed QR code from your smartphone. So you pull up AliPay, you pull up WeChat, you pull up Grab, you pull up one of the other apps, and you display a dynamic QR code that changes every 20 seconds or so to maintain that security. The use case on the left is the more interesting one. It's a static QR code that the merchant has. So it's essentially like a Bitcoin wallet or just an account number. So you scan that and you're paying to the account. So it's the first case is kind of a request to pay, and then the second one is a credit transfer or a push. Sorry, the first one direct debit and the second one a credit transfer. The reason why the second one is so compelling is the fact that for a merchant to get set up with an account is very simple. As long as they have AliPay, they can produce one of these QR codes, they can print it out, and they can display it. And in many cases, this gentleman here is a fishmonger. You see merchants all across big cities like Shanghai and increasingly second and third tier cities, even in Tibet, that have QR codes that they're using to accept mobile payments. And that's incredibly empowering. It allows people access not only to financial services, but as we'll see, to payments, but increasingly a large amount of financial services as well. All of the things that we can layer on top of those value propositions. Why QR code payments? Well, the big argument is that it's hardware independent. The cost to get set up on QR codes, either as a consumer or a merchant, is very small. The bank may have a small KYC process to go through. In the case of AliPay, you need to have a bank account, but then once you do the KYC through linking that bank account, you're in business, literally. And you can use a consumer account for a merchant account. It tends to be fast as well. In a card transaction in many countries, including China, if you're using a chip and PIN card in China, it's chip, PIN, and signature. And that's at least a 60-second transaction. If you're using QR codes, it's milliseconds, maybe a second. It's very easy to use. When you see how these QR codes are embedded in the platforms that people use every day, for you to move in your WeChat wallet from your chat to displaying a QR code is a matter of a couple of clicks. You don't have to worry about getting out your wallet or your card or anything else. In fact, when I got to Singapore, I left the house a couple of times just taking my mobile phone, not realizing that I wasn't in China anymore and realizing I didn't have cash with me to pay bills. It's also simpler and cheaper. If you look at the value stack of a typical credit card transaction, there's a lot in there. There's a lot around fraud, POS installation, merchant processing. A lot of that can be eliminated in QR code payments, in digital payments. And that allows us to compress that value proposition while still providing the same level of service in a faster and cheaper method. I just want to note, some people are taking photos. There's a link at the end where you can download my slides, so you'll be able to download all the slides. Of course, if you want a photo of me, then yeah, please go on and take it. It might be your only chance for a while. QR code development across Asia has developed rapidly. Japan pioneered QR codes, and then China innovated on that to create the kind of payment use case across Asia. And so we are seeing places like in Singapore, DBS and OCBC launched QR code payments, and now we have a unified QR code payment standard in Singapore that's not entirely seamless, as any of you know who've been down there recently. But here in Thailand, Japan, all across the region, QR codes are developing very rapidly. At the same time that QR codes are happening on the consumer side, real-time payments are developing rapidly as well. Ever since the UK went to faster payments, which I believe was about 2008, we've seen an uptake in countries globally, but specifically here in Asia with countries like Malaysia, Australia, Hong Kong, Thailand, Singapore, all moving to domestic real-time payments. And really across the region, Japan was one of the first to embrace real-time payments a number of years ago, although it may not be fully 24/7. It is real-time for the time that it is open. And across the region, we've seen this continued development and maturation. And in many ways, these real-time payments have become the new normal, driven by national payment infrastructure modernization and digital payments as competitors. Governments across the region have decided in order to keep up and stay competitive, they need to adopt real-time payments. And a lot of that is coming from those digital payment players. If I can make an AliPay transaction, if I'm a Chinese consumer and I can make an AliPay transaction in Hong Kong and it's instant, why shouldn't I be able to make the same one, not using a card, but using a transfer of some sort as well? So there's these elements of just general payment system modernization and the digital payment revolution that are really driving the adoption of these payments across the region. And in many ways, this is just a natural evolution of the payments market. It's something to be expected. Although there is a difference between instant payment and near instant payments, we're getting to the point that consumers, small, medium enterprises, corporates expect near instant payment at least. If the payment doesn't come through in a couple of seconds, then it's taking too long. Unfortunately for banks, it's no longer really a point of differentiation because everybody has access to the same, the arms race, if everybody has the same access to the technologies, so everybody's able to provide those real-time payments. Increasingly, it's about what you can put on top of those. And what you can put on top of those is a key element of this idea of platforms. I'm just going to skip ahead one slide and come back. What we've done on this slide is we took on the left, we took the WeChat wallet. And does anybody use WeChat here? A couple people here and there. If you have a Chinese WeChat wallet, this will be what comes up on the screen. And so, as you can tell from my accent, I'm Canadian by birth, but American by growing up. And we match the wallet up to what you would expect to use in the United States. So if you're booking a car, you'd open up your Lyft or your Uber app. If you were paying your utilities, you might open Citibank. If you were doing, in this case, women's style, you would be using eBay to potentially buy something online using e-commerce. In China, there's one app to do that, and it's called WeChat. Actually, there's two apps, WeChat and AliPay. And the breadth of products and services that these companies are able to put on these platforms is pretty breathtaking. I mean, when you consider all of the things that are involved here, from the general perspective, I can book a taxi, I can book a flight, I can chat with my friends, I can order things online. But more importantly, from a financial services perspective, up at the top, I can make payments. But when I dig down deeper, I can invest in wealth management products. I can borrow money. I can access my finances in a different way than I could in other places. If I'm back in the States, I've got to open up 4 or 5 different apps to do the same thing. In China, it's just one. This is definitely a trend that we're seeing in Asia. This is a screenshot on the right from GrabPay. So this was just taken from my account a couple of days ago. Already in GrabPay, you can pay, request, top up rewards. Grab is really focused on the drivers first. So the lending around the drivers. I think we're going to see something around insurance in the next couple months of them providing insurance services to the drivers. But increasingly, they will come to the consumers as well. And providing those financial products and services to consumers are incredibly important. There are a couple of different implications of this change. The first implication is the financial consideration. So we calculated that in 2018, $47 billion US in fees were lost to the digital payment providers. So this is effectively saying that transactions that would have typically gone across a card network that were now going across AliPay or WeChat Pay, the value of those fees amounted to nearly $50 billion US. Now, for me, that's an incredible amount of money. I'd be happy with a 10th of that, even a 20th. I'm not greedy. But for a bank like an ICBC, it's maybe not that big of a deal. I mean, ICBC has tens of trillions of dollars in assets under management. But it's still an impact. It still impacts from the revenue side. But the greater impact is from the data. The data that these companies can collect through these platforms on you, the individual, is increasingly critical. If you just think about when I go back to Shanghai, I'll be going back next week. In any day, I'll be ordering food online, I'll be taking a taxi, I'll be shared bikes, I'll be chatting with friends, I'll be buying tickets and various things for entertainment and travel. There's an incredible amount of data about each one of those transactions each day that the platform is gathering about me. Think about if you're trying to make a credit decision on somebody and you see that they're taking a taxi from a bar street to their house every morning at 3 a.m., and then at 11 a.m. they're taking a taxi from their house to work. It's not me, it's a friend. You might make decisions on the credit worthiness of that individual. You might say, okay, this may be, because they're spending so much time at the bar, we may not want to give them credit. That's insight that a bank would never have about that individual. Now, some would argue that you're giving up quite a bit of privacy from sharing that information. But realistically, the thing that's sitting on the table, hopefully it's sitting on the table because I'm so interesting that nobody's sending messages, but your mobile phone is giving away more information than anything else that you've done in your life. And why do you do that? Well, it's very convenient. So that, when you're coming over here from San Francisco, your wife can get in touch. If you're coming down here from Hong Kong, you can message back to the office. And it's the same thing with a lot of these data. I mean, I am reasonably technically savvy. I've come to the conclusion that personal privacy doesn't really exist anymore. As an American citizen, I can probably say that because, having lived in China and my wife being a journalist for one of the major Western press in China, I think, our privacy was gone as soon as we got married. Increasingly, data is the critical oil. Data is the new oil for a lot of these transactions, especially when we move to the idea of situational finance. And so this is the idea of providing the right product to the right price to the right person. I was giving a talk last year in Shanghai, and a girl raised her hand at the end of the talk, and she said, look, I was using Taobao, which is the Amazon-esque equivalent there in China, one of the largest e-commerce platforms. And she said, they offered me 10,000 renminbi, so about $1,500 to borrow when I was checking out. And she said, why did they do that? I said, well, did you use the 10,000 renminbi? She said, yeah, I used it. I said, well, what did you do with it? She says, I bought a bag. And I said, well, that's why they offered it to you, is because they knew that, based on your previous transactions, they can see your salary coming in, they can see your expenses coming in, they can see what you're spending money on, they can make a reasonable assessment that based on the goods that you're buying, and she bought a bag, an expensive bag, so, they knew her profile such that they were comfortable offering her credit. Again, not something that the banks would be equipped to do in this scenario. So platforms are really critical for digital payments going forward. The last element of this is cross-border retail payments, or cross-border payments in general, but talking retail, kind of SME and consumer. And Craig touched on this a little bit before. We've looked at the market, and you can basically break down retail cross-border payments in APAC as e-commerce, tourism, and other. So these are the primary use cases. Education doesn't tend to be a retail-driven activity. It tends to be more people send wires to the university, so we didn't consider cross-border education in here. But effectively, for a tourist or somebody doing e-commerce, the credit card is the tool of choice for making those transactions. So when I come here to Thailand, I try to not have to be stuck with Thai baht at the end of the day, so I use my credit card as much as I can. Similarly, if I'm buying something online, like a plane ticket, I'm using a credit card to do that, to combine that. But credit cards are very expensive. When you look at the cost of an international credit card transaction, as I found out, as I mentioned before, with my Singapore credit card, I'm paying 3%, and then the merchant is paying anywhere between 1% and 3% on the other end as well. That's not even considering dynamic currency conversion, which is a great way for banks to make additional money on these transactions and on the FX. So the average cross-border debit card fee is about 5 to 8%, and credit cards a little bit more. So if we bring together all of the things that we've been looking at over the course of this presentation, it gives an interesting scenario for the future. We have rapid smartphone adoption in Asia, potentially higher than anywhere else in the world. We have this QR code standardization that's happening domestically and increasingly regionally across the region. We have payment system modernization, so we have these domestic payment infrastructures, and the need for cross-border alternatives to be honest, the credit cards are too expensive as they are now for the services that we're getting on the back of that. So there's this perfect storm of change that's coming to the market, and really is the idea of something that we thought of about the vision of cross-border QR code payments. So the idea of instant cross-border QR code payments. Now, this is all enabled by the idea that domestic payment infrastructure is already real time. In addition, you have standardization like ISO 20022 that's coming to market that essentially makes a domestic payment seamless into international payments as well. I know Swift is adopting the standard, and I'm sure Ripple will be using it as well. And then you have QR codes, which means that anybody with a reasonable smartphone, or with a smartphone for that matter, is able to either accept or make these payments. And so this scenario is quite interesting. You have all of these things coming together in Southeast Asia that make it a potential reality for the future. Now, if you look at what the implication of this could be, we'll talk about the cost in a minute, but for banks, it makes it very easy to integrate. If you have essentially a cloud, a processing cloud on the back end, integration directly with the banks is very easy. A lot of this would be driven by APIs into payment gateways. For merchants, it's easy to adopt these payments. All you have to do is either be able to print out a QR code or display a QR code, or read a QR code for that matter, and you're in business. Indeed, when I was in Shanghai when QR codes were first launched, and many people would just have their cash register, their traditional point of sale, and an iPhone sitting next to the traditional point of sale with a QR code that they could pull up to accept AliPay payments. Now we have alternative smart PAWs that are able to do that. And for consumers, it doesn't make a difference. If you think about that scenario that we just presented, the Thai consumer that's going to Singapore, if that person can use their prompt pay, their native prompt pay app to either scan or display a QR code when they go to Singapore, there's no change for consumers. It makes it very easy for them to adopt this payment system as well. From the commercial perspective, it could be quite attractive as well. This is the same 4 to 8% that I displayed before on the credit card side. If you think about that value stack that we presented earlier on, if you can compress that down, because this scenario would be for instant, low-value payments where you wouldn't necessarily need things like fraud protection to the same level. You wouldn't need returns or chargebacks. And the loyalty programs could be kept with other applications and other services around that. We can lower the value, or lower the cost while maintaining the same value for the consumers. So it's a very interesting scenario that looks at all of these kind of transition points that we're getting across the payments industry that could really change the way that certainly consumer payments and potentially small, medium enterprise payments could change as well. So just a few things in conclusion here. Digital payments are changing the way that 4 billion people bank and will handle their financial lives. Initially, this was payments. But with all of the different products and services that are being layered on top of that, increasingly people's financial lives is now through their phone. And it's also changing the nature. If you talk to individuals in China and you ask them who they invest with, they're more than likely to say WeChat or AliPay. They're not going to say Guotai Asset Management or the asset managers. Their viewpoint, the brand awareness and that channel for a lot of these financial products and services is shifting away. Real-time domestic payments have become the new normal. Increasingly, you as a financial institution or participant in the market, you have to be real-time or at least near real-time to compete. And that's just the normal. E-commerce and tourism drive cross-border retail payments. 62% of cross-border payments right now, at least on the retail side, are card payments. And when you consider that the 5 to 8% fees on that, that's a tremendous amount of money and a tremendous market opportunity. $9.7 billion per year is the cost to merchants when you look at merchants and consumers just in ASEAN in this space. So the cost of using credit cards is massive. This QR code interoperability is opening up new ways of looking at cross-border payments. The idea of scanning a QR code and being able to process a payment is something that's very new, but it's very secure, it's very easy to implement, and it's very accessible for merchants and consumers. But the competition is moving quickly. From the north, we have the Ant Financials and Tencents of the world that are rapidly moving into Southeast Asia. And from the west, we have the Visas, the MasterCards, the TransferWises that are all expanding their APAC reach. All of these companies are providing challenges to banks in Southeast Asia and are one of the key challenges. And we believe that targeting this cross-border debit card market, there's a tremendous opportunity to drive down costs and provide additional values to the customers. Using payments at that base layer, it also allows you to drive additional products and services to beat some of these companies at their own game. So, if you'd like a copy of the slides, please just scan the QR code. You can download the slides from our website. You can see I'm into QR codes, not just for payments. It's not a payment QR code, just to be fair. We have a different QR code from that. So thank you for sticking around, and hopefully you found that interesting and valuable. These are just some of the things that we're seeing certainly in the payment space in Asia, but it's food for thought as you go forward and you define your strategy for 2019 and beyond about how you're going to leverage some of these trends in your own business. So thank you. Happy to take questions.
Any questions? Michael?
Yeah, so the question was, how would the compliance work for cross-border QR codes? That's a good question. A lot of that would be, the KYC would need to be built into that from the domestic payment systems, I think. And then, yeah, those checks would still need to be there, but kind of similar to a credit card as well. I mean, the value of the payments that we're looking at are not super high value payments, so the level of compliance checks that would need to be done are probably not as great. But we'd look at having something kind of similar to that because it would be a similar usage case. Okay. Oh.
With respect to the static QR codes, while static QR codes provide a very simple solution, what have you seen and what do you see going forward, probably more importantly, in terms of certainty of receipt of funds? Because obviously if you've got a printed piece of paper with a QR code, it's difficult to ensure that those funds hit your bank account.
I mean, the beauty about static QR codes is the responsibility of the recipient, being the merchant in this case, to ensure that it's accurate. Most of the scenarios where you see static QR codes, it's a scenario where there's somebody there. The fraud that has happened around QR codes in China, you know, they have the shared bikes, the mobikes and the OFOs, and somebody will take a sticker, a QR code sticker, and put it on top of the sticker that's on the bike. So instead of sending the money to Mobike, you're sending the money to Mr. Joe, who's sitting in his apartment, you know, siphoning off funds. So in most of the merchant cases, it's the merchant's responsibility to make sure that static QR code is there, but it's near certainty if they are accurately printing that out. Typically what happens is that when they're making the transaction, the consumer will show that the transaction is complete. So there will be a picture and the person's name, or at least a portion of the person's name. So that kind of validates. There's no strong automatic way of doing that, for sure. Automated way, I should say.
Yeah, I think it's something to be thought about further because, I mean, to give you a sort of analogy, you know, in Sydney, where I'm from, they've enabled, you know, sort of tap payments even with your phone on public transport, and pretty much, and it makes a certain beep when you do that. And pretty much the next thing that came out in the market were these rip-off phone apps which would make the same beep and wouldn't make the payment once you can get onto the bus. So I can imagine the same problem happening with this particular scenario. It's small amounts of money, but you know, you know, these things happen. So do you think that may be a challenge going forward?
So one challenge, so China being the big case study in this, the one challenge in this, and we work very closely with Ant Financial and Tencent, they are very loath to disclose any fraud numbers, any numbers that come across on fraud. AliPay claims to have I believe it's hundredths of a percent, so fractions of a basis point fraud rates on their platform. How much you can believe in that, you know, there's probably a lot that's underreported or not reported by the merchants. So that, yeah, certainly is a challenge around that. As you mentioned, I mean, most of these transactions are small value. And I think, you know, there's, to give you an idea, like at a wet market in Shanghai where you might see one of these static codes, the person is behind, you know, a meter of vegetables and fruits. So even if I stole something and ran off with it, they'd have to jump across that. So I think there's there's other challenges that they're facing that are similar in scope and scale that, this would be one of the other things that they would need to certainly pay attention to as a merchant.
What would be the scenario of using QR code in cross-border revenues? Like how people have is the beneficiary getting any QR code?
I think how it will happen is up to people in this room. You've got a payment network that can provide the infrastructure and the financial institutions that would be interested in it. But yeah, I mean, it could. There's a number of different ways that it could be implemented. I mean, fundamentally, the infrastructure that's needed is not that much. You need some kind of underlying messaging infrastructure to handle that integrates into the domestic payment systems. So if we were looking at like a RippleNet-enabled solution, RippleNet would sit in the middle, already connected into Prompt Pay here in Thailand and say Fast in Singapore, and then providing that cross-border connectivity into that. Then in that case, the end result, it would involve a little bit of integration from the bank to enable it for their consumers. So that ties into the back end of the Prompt Pay app as an example, using that Thailand-Singapore example. But in theory, the integration and the setup for this would not be tremendously large. Great. Thank you very much. I'll be around for the rest of the day if you have any other questions.